Next section in Digital Audio Strand 3, Standards 1 and 2, Equipment Setup for Recording Audio. Anyone know what this is called? You've already used it, we've already talked about it, described it. Yep, you can call it a few names. This is the mixing board, a mixer, a console, or if you go into a really nice place, it's a desk. And I'll explain that in a second. But first, let's just talk about this a little bit. We have most of these features on our mixing console. We have inputs. We have the microphone inputs, which are really called XLRs. Okay, so you got XLR sockets, and I think that's about how many we have. I think we have 4 across the top. And then we have more of, what do you call these sockets here, these jacks. These are actually 1/4 inch. Here it says unbalanced, that's fine. They aren't necessarily, by the way, but they probably are. And I'll explain that another time. It sounds like some of you guys are unbalanced. There's the trim pot or the gain. This is called the gain or the attenuator, and this is the first thing that you do in adjusting how much volume is coming into the board. And it's very rare that you don't have to have that cranked up to at least noon or maybe the 3 o'clock position. You got to get as much audio into the board as you can. It says the EQs or the treble, the mids and the basses. We have bass and highs and lows, EQs. Pump up the bass, pump up the highs. Don't tell anyone I did that. Effects send control, monitor send control. We don't talk about that too much in Digital 1. We don't need to do too much with that. The pan pot. I always like calling it that. We'll get to that probably later on in this section. A knob is also really a potentiometer. That's the old term for it. Technically it's a potentiometer, or abbreviated as a pot. So we have the pan pot. We can mute or solo. It says a peak LED, so there's a light that says whether you've soloed or muted depending on the mixer. And then of course the fader. You can call it a slider. Most people call them faders as far as I know. These can actually be automated, and in our theater booth over there we have a very nice mixer. I'm going to guess it's around a $20,000 mixing board, and it has automation. So you set things the way you want them, computerize it, plug it in, and then you're in the middle of a theater show and all of a sudden you just hit a setting and the faders go to the right position. And sometimes they'll do it while you're watching. It's like a ghost is moving the faders up and down.
And by the way, as you can see, moving faders.
So you have the inputs and the outputs and the master fader, the master audio. Sometimes it's a knob that controls how much volume is going out of the board. And then you have your meters, which we'll also talk about some more, that tell you what the volume is going out of the board. Okay, those are the essential parts of a mixing board. How does that mixing board compare with our mixing board? You might remember we had 4 microphone inputs, I think maybe another 10 or so of the 1/4 inch inputs. How many inputs does this beast have? Okay, so this beast is a lot more difficult to run, right? Not really. It's about 20% more difficult to run. Because the point is, once you know what one column does, you know what all the other columns do. This is Skywalker Sound, where probably the majority of your action movies are mixed, probably a lot of the comic book movies. And when you walk into a place like this, you don't say, "That's a nice mixer." What you do is you say, "That's a nice desk." Because a desk indicates that it's a more expensive one. And the guy that's running the board there, the desk, will say, "Well, thank you. We actually got a really good deal on it. It was custom made, and it only cost us $800,000. Okay, so if you're in a situation wherever you're viewing this, if you can have a mixer board up at the same time as I'm talking about these things, it'll probably help you. Number 2 says the part of the mixing board that receives audio cables. So you got the microphone cable coming from the microphone and you plug it into an input. Those are the inputs. You have a guitar and you've got the 1/4 inch cable, the connector, the 1/4 inch goes into the 1/4 inch input. Number 3, the part of the mixing board that boosts the signal from mic level to line level. That's the preamp. And at the first stage on the mixing board is where the preamp is, and that's where you're also adjusting your trim or your attenuation or your gain. They call it like 3 different words. Gain's probably the best one. And so, like I say, it's very typical that your gain is up to, the top position. It's up to noon or maybe even 3 o'clock. Very common to increase the gain to get a good signal coming into the board to begin with. You want to work with as hot of a signal, as strong of a signal as you possibly can. Okay, the next one is the part of the mixing board that positions the signal left or right. That's that pan pot. So at some point I might just kind of have some fun with you and say, what is found in your mom's kitchen that is also found on a mixing board? A pan pot. It pans left and right, puts the signal either in your left ear or your right ear. One thing I forgot to mention on the preamps is they are actually quite important. If you're going for really clean sound and you're just trying to make the sound as clean as you can all the way through the stages, you've got the best mic, a good microphone cord, good connectors, sometimes they're gold-plated connectors, then that stage of preamp is very important to you because it takes a relatively quiet signal and has to amp it up. And if it doesn't amp that signal up, increase that volume cleanly, then it adds some dirty noise, staticky noise, some hiss, some other things like that. So some people spend a lot of money on preamps. We spent a little bit of money and got special preamps too that we can use instead of the board. My ears are no longer good enough to hear the difference. I can't tell the difference between the outboard preamps that we have and the ones that are just built into the board. But supposedly they're about 20% cleaner. Okay, going back to number 5, the part of the mixing board that sends the signal out. I'm not even going to say it. If you know what number 2 is, you should get what number 5 is. Goes out to the world, out to your speakers. It also goes out to your computer in some way, because you're probably actually recording on a computer. 6, the part of the mixing board that adjusts the highs or the treble and the lows, the bass. So I call that EQ. You can call it equalization. You can say you're adjusting frequencies, but in my experience, most recording engineers just call it the EQ, adjusting the EQ, short for equalization. The part of the mixing board that shows the loudness of the signal. So these are all meters, and you've got them. You've seen them everywhere. You probably haven't seen this very much. This looks like an old speedometer if you're driving an old Mustang or Corvette. But these are all meters that tell you the volume units. So if your meter is, as they say, pegging up in here, well, you actually want it to get to where it's just starting to go into the red. Just starting to go into the red. But you don't want it pegging up in the +6 area, because then you're getting a signal that is going to be distorted. But these are called volume units, not voltage units as some people think. We have a nice set of meters that we have hooked up to the TV, and they also might work for us. I actually haven't tried it this year. But we have it hooked up to the TV monitor so that we can watch our announcements, because we never have a sound engineer that turns up the anchors loud enough, it seems. So let's talk about that. So if it's metering up in the red the whole time, then you're going to have audio that is clipping. You can say you're clipping, you can say you've pegged the meters, there's other ways of saying it, but it's too loud, simply put. If that's too loud, Goldilocks, what is this? That's too soft. But again, Goldilocks, that's too loud, that's too soft, what is that? That's just right. And that's what you want. You want to just barely hit the red. Now sometimes you've got a situation where you're going to have to do what they call riding it. You're going to have to ride the fader, ride the volume, because you've got a situation where, let's say it's a stand-up comic, and he talks really quietly into the mic, and he's saying, okay, son, I need you to do your homework now. Dad, I don't want to do my homework now. Son, you need to do your homework now, and you need to do your chores. Dad, you take all the fun out of life. Okay, so if you've got that kind of situation, you're going to have to be riding it, because you will be here, and then you're going to be there, and then you're going to be here. But you want to try to keep it as even as you possibly can as a sound engineer. I should have looked ahead. That's actually one of the vocabulary words there. Words to describe when the signal exceeds the VU meter is clipping or peaking. Like I said, I've also heard pegging the meter. That probably comes from speedometers though. So more commonly used are peaking or clipping. Clipping is the one you hear all the time. 9, another term describing overmodulated or unwanted sound. Overmodulated sounds like a really impressive word. Basically, again, it's just saying you've got too much. And usually when you have too much, you have distortion. There can be other ways to introduce distortion. You can have other problems. You can have a tube. If you have a tube in your system somewhere, particularly in the preamps, a tube can be going bad on you and you get distortion. But you have unwanted sound. You've got to clean that up before you do any more recording, because there's nothing you can do. You can't fix distortion. Not really. A computerized system for manipulating sound, often called a DAW. What does a DAW stand for? Digital Audio Workstation. A digital audio workstation. And you may have heard of some of these brands. You've heard of GarageBand. Pretty much every teenager has heard of GarageBand. This one has been the king forever. I was actually the first guy in Utah to buy a Pro Tools system. Some of you may have heard of a guy named Lex D'Azevedo. Little story here really quick. Lex D'Azevedo has done a lot of music for the LDS church type things. There was a musical way back in the day, like in the early 70s or somewhere in the 70s, called Saturday's Warrior. So he was a pretty big name. I think he might be retired now. He's produced a lot of albums locally. Anyway, he and I both went to kind of an executive suite of a hotel, and a couple other guys, and we got pitched on Pro Tools by a company called Digidesign. And I said, that's the future. You're recording on a computer. We used to record on reel-to-reel tape. Some of us even recorded on cassette tape, because there were some things you could actually do on a cassette, but that's really crappy quality. So now recording onto a digital computer allows you to do a lot of things, a lot more editing. So I said, that's the future, and I'm thinking, how am I going to come up with the $6,000 to get into this? And I see him stand up, Lex D'Azevedo, and he goes off into kind of a side room in this kind of big executive suite. And I can say to myself, he's making a deal there. Well, I can't let Lex get it and not me. So I do it. I somehow sign a check and get Pro Tools, and I found out that he backed out. He decided, nah, I'm not going to get it after all. So that made me the first guy in Utah to get Pro Tools. But more common, I would say, are probably GarageBand, well, and then we're going to show here, Adobe Audition for sure, and I would say probably Cubase, but all of these are being used. This is actually an Apple product. I think they still make it. I had it for a time, but I decided it didn't give me much of an advantage over Pro Tools. So now I use Cubase, Audition, and Pro Tools. I'm still the most comfortable with Pro Tools, but Cubase does a ton more. Now for a political question. Is what we use, Adobe Audition, technically CC for Creative Cloud. You can find Adobe Audition like CS6, buy a disc and just own it and not have to pay on a monthly basis. But in the last 3 years, everything's been on the cloud. Is Adobe Audition a DAW? I wrote there no MIDI. Who knows what MIDI is? MIDI is the abbreviation of Musical Instrument Digital Interface. So MIDI means I can hook up a keyboard, I can hook up a guitar controller. There's even an aerophone that kind of mimics a saxophone, but typically it's a keyboard and there's other things. So I'm playing a keyboard and it's sending a digital signal, not just what you hear out of the audio like a piano, right? A piano has a hammer hitting a string. A synthesizer type electronic keyboard sends digital signals, zeros and ones, to the computer, and then you can do a lot of manipulation, and technically you're really doing most of the MIDI on the computer, not from the keyboard, but the computer itself does a lot of MIDI manipulation. And you can have virtual instruments. So you have on your computer all the piano sounds in the world. Your keyboard is just the interface. And you say, okay, I don't like that sound. You go to your computer, click on grand piano, and then you play, yeah, I like that better. What if I found an old honky-tonk piano, like from the 1920s? Click on a different instrument on your computer. Now it sounds like a honky-tonk. Who knows the song from The Sting, The Entertainer? Da 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 da, right? So you want that kind of a sound. Well, those can all be on these systems. Particularly some of these like Cubase have all those MIDI instruments, or you can buy more of them and just work right in your computer. So the question is Adobe Audition really a DAW? It is, but anybody that works with MIDI would say it's not a very full functional DAW because it doesn't do any MIDI. As far as I know, it doesn't, and they're probably working on it. So again, in a recording studio situation, you might not use Adobe Audition for very much, but in a radio station or just audio books or something like that, or I guess even just mixing a live band, or not necessarily a live band, but mixing a band that you recorded, it'll do a lot of good things. And I'm going to show you some of those as we go on. Anyway, just write in Audition here and realize it doesn't have MIDI, and for your future knowledge, you may want to have something more than Adobe Audition if you are a musician. Some mixing boards include processing. Probably should have written processing gear. But anyway, it doesn't need really another word to end that sentence. Processing is reverb, compression, noise reduction. You take a signal and then you process it. I'm trying to think of anything that is like that. I almost said processed food, which would be kind of funny, and we could say that. So let's say you take original sources of food, some vegetables, some meat, and then you process them. And you rinse them, and you cook them, and you add vitamins to them, and whatever it is, okay? The cereal you eat in the morning has no resemblance whatsoever to an original grain or whatever that it started out like, right? Unless it's granola. Same thing here. You take the signal and you process it. So you guys know what reverb is. Reverb is just multiple echoes. That's one we could have had. A processor could be an echo or a delay processor. So the word echo is all by itself, the original signal, echo, but then I put on processing of echoes. Echo, 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 echo. Okay? That's what processors do. You have never listened to anything in the last 10 years that isn't heavily processed. No one actually hardly well, there are unplugged. That's not fair to say. There are unplugged concerts and unplugged albums. So that was very unfair to say. They're still processed a little bit, but it's trying to be as natural to the original sound as possible. But by far, most of the stuff you hear on the radio is a processed sound. And that's okay. Kind of makes things more fun. What does SNR stand for? Signal to noise ratio. SNR. Sounds like watching something on Saturday night, but that would be SNL. Signal to noise ratio. That means you've got a signal and then you've got noise that'll try to interfere with that signal, and I call it the noise floor. So do all sound engineers. And so if you were to just close your eyes and listen in this room, you'd say, what noise exists already in this room that is unwanted? It's the noise floor before you hear my actual voice. Okay, you can hear the air conditioner. You can hear a computer humming a little bit. Sometimes you can hear some noise out in the hallway. That's the noise floor. A lot of times it's just some movement of the air, and it just exists. Just atoms colliding into each other will create noise, even if you're in the deepest hole down an elevator shaft where no one's making any noise, there's no ventilation, there's still a little bit of just existing noise. So you have the noise floor, and then you have a signal. And the idea is to increase the signal in comparison to the noise floor as much as possible. I shouldn't have moved this hand. whatever the noise floor is, and I'm suggesting here we have 10 decibels of audio that just exist, for example. And the voice audio, for example, is 90 decibels. So that means we have a 80 decibel difference between the noise floor and the signal. Whatever you can do to increase that diminishes that hiss, that air, the noise floor as much as you possibly can. All right, this just shows the same thing. I should have pulled up the graph before. So you've got a noise floor, you've got the signal, and then the difference in decibels. So again, as much as you can, you want to increase your signal and get the hottest signal you can into your board. The board itself, maybe even the cables, can increase the noise. Often I've worked on noisy boards. And again, you spend a lot of money on your mixing board. So sometimes you'll have specifications on the instructions, on the manual, on the selling material of what the signal to noise ratio is for a mixing board. For a microphone, does a microphone generate any self noise? Because maybe it's a condenser microphone and there's electricity going into it. Does it have a good signal to noise ratio on whatever self noise it might generate? The mixing board, the speakers, amplifiers, all along the way, you don't want to have any more noise introduced to the signal than you absolutely have to.